Deep in the shadows of World War II's darkest chapters lies a secret so heinous, so cruel, that its very mention sends shivers down the spine. Unit 731. Not a battlefield, not a prison camp, but a hidden laboratory of death, buried in the frozen fields of Manchuria. Behind its walls, doctors traded the oath to heal for the will to destroy. Men of science became architects of suffering. Human beings were reduced to numbers, to logs, and fed into a machine of cruelty that few dared imagine, and fewer still survived. For decades, the world was told nothing. Justice was denied. Silence fell like snow over the graves of the forgotten. Tonight, we peel back that silence. Tonight, we confront the horror that history tried to bury.
Deep in the heart of Manchuria, winter stretched endlessly across the land. The fields lay white and still, the snow muffling every sound. It was a silence so pure, so absolute, that it could almost be mistaken for peace. But beneath that frozen calm, a darker reality stirred. Hidden beyond barbed wire and guard towers stood a sprawling complex of brick and concrete. To outsiders, it was said to be a water purification plant. In truth, it was something else entirely, a city of secrets, a factory of death. Here, men in white coats walked with the authority of gods. They carried clipboards, syringes, and scalpels, but their work was not to heal. Their mission was to perfect the art of biological warfare. Behind locked gates and sealed doors, prisoners were stripped not only of their freedom, but of their very humanity. They were given no names, only numbers. The doctors called them maryuta, logs, to be used, tested, and burned when no longer needed. The snow outside concealed the stench of death that seeped from the chimneys. The villagers nearby dared not speak of what they saw, but they noticed. The endless trains that brought men, women, and children into the compound. The guards who left carrying supplies, but never returned with the prisoners. And always, the smoke, curling into the cold sky, as if the wind itself was trying to carry away the evidence of what was happening here. This place had a name, whispered only in fear, Unit 731. It was not just another military installation of the Japanese Empire. It was a laboratory of nightmares, one that blurred the line between war and atrocity, between science and savagery. The silence of Manchuria in those years was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of secrets. A silence heavy with screams that never reached the outside world. And in that silence, the darkest chapter of Japan's war would be written. The story of Unit 731 did not begin with the snow-covered silence of Manchuria. It began years earlier, in the heart of a nation consumed by ambition and militarism. Japan, once isolated from the world, had risen rapidly into an empire hungry for land, resources, and power. The islands could no longer contain its vision. Its leaders turned outward, their eyes fixed on Asia. In 1931, Japanese troops invaded Manchuria, seizing it from China in a swift campaign. They declared it the puppet state of Manchukuo, draping their conquest in the language of progress and order. But beneath the slogans and ceremonies lay a harsher truth. Manchuria became a laboratory of empire, where Japan could experiment with new forms of control, colonization, and war. It was here that a young and ambitious military doctor saw his chance. His name was Shiro Ishii. Brilliant, persuasive, and utterly ruthless, Ishii had studied the potential of biological warfare while others dismissed it as impractical. He argued that germs could be as powerful as bullets, that microbes could achieve what armies could not. To the warlords of Tokyo, his words were irresistible. A weapon invisible, unstoppable, capable of crippling entire populations without firing a single shot. Ishii promised results, and he delivered them with chilling enthusiasm. He toured Europe and studied the latest scientific methods. He exploited the fears left behind by the horrors of chemical gas in the First World War. He spoke of national destiny, of Japan's divine mission to lead Asia. Every speech, every experiment, was wrapped in the language of patriotism. Behind it, however, lay something darker, the transformation of medicine into a tool of death. By the late 1930s, with the war in China escalating and Japan's empire expanding, Ishii convinced his superiors to give him what he wanted most, absolute power, a facility to conduct his research far from prying eyes. The site was chosen. A remote stretch of land outside the city of Harbin in occupied Manchuria. Here, under the banner of the Imperial Army, Ishii would build a secret city. To the world, it was called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. To those who knew its true purpose, it was Unit 731. And with its creation, the path toward atrocity was set. What began as one man's ambition would soon grow into a machine of suffering that consumed thousands of lives, and scarred history forever. In the quiet outskirts of Harbin, a monstrous project began to take shape. What rose from the frozen ground of Manchuria was no ordinary military base. It was a hidden city, sprawling across 6 square kilometers, ringed with walls, barbed wire, and armed watchtowers. Within its boundaries stood more than 150 buildings, laboratories, barracks, prisons, power plants, and crematoria. On paper, it was an unremarkable facility of the Guangdong Army, tasked with epidemic prevention and water purification. In reality, it was designed for something far more sinister. This was the empire of Shiro Ishii. He moved through its corridors with the confidence of a man who knew he was untouchable. Behind him followed teams of doctors, surgeons, and scientists, men sworn to heal, now sworn to kill in the name of progress. They were given resources without limit, authority without question, and human subjects without end. The prisoners arrived in endless streams. Chinese civilians accused of resistance, farmers taken from their fields, women and children dragged from their homes. There were also Koreans, Mongols, and even captured Russians. They entered through iron gates, stripped of their names, their dignity, their very humanity. Within the compound, they were called Maryuta, logs. A cruel euphemism chosen by Ishii and his men, as though the prisoners were nothing more than wood to be cut, burned, and discarded. Inside, the air reeked of fear. Barred cells held men who whispered prayers in the dark. Women clutched their children tightly, knowing nothing could protect them from what was to come. Guards patrolled with rifles and bayonets, their eyes cold, their orders absolute. Escape was impossible. Silence was demanded. Death was inevitable. At the heart of the complex stood the laboratories, spotless, sterile, and gleaming with modern equipment. Here, medicine was inverted. Here, knowledge was twisted into cruelty. Every instrument, every scalpel, every vial of bacteria served not the preservation of life, but its deliberate destruction. Beyond the laboratories rose the smokestacks of the crematoria. Black plumes rose daily into the Manchurian sky, carrying with them the ash of bodies reduced to nothing. Villagers in the distance would glance nervously at the drifting smoke, pretending not to notice, because to notice was to risk their lives. The city of Pingfong was not a place of healing. It was a machine of death, built brick by brick for a single purpose, to strip humanity down to flesh, bone, and data. And within these walls, the experiments would soon begin. Inside the sealed halls of Pingfong, medicine became a weapon. Here, the line between science and savagery was not blurred, it was erased. The doctors of Unit 731 carried themselves with the precision of scholars, but their subjects were not patients. They were condemned men, women, and children, treated not as human beings but as data points in experiments too cruel to imagine. The frostbite tests began first. Prisoners were marched outside into the biting Manchurian winter. Their bare arms and legs were plunged into tubs of ice water, held there until the flesh hardened, stiff as wood. The doctors would then strike the frozen limbs with sticks, listening for the sound, a hollow crack like breaking glass. Once the frostbite was perfected, the victims were carried back inside. Their limbs were thawed with hot water, flames, or even rubbed with salt, all while the doctors took meticulous notes. No anesthesia. No mercy. Just observation until flesh blackened, peeled away, and life faded from the body. Other prisoners were strapped to wooden tables, their chests opened while still conscious. The doctors performed vivisections, dissecting human beings alive, so they could observe how organs responded to disease in real time. Beating hearts were cut open. Lungs infected with plague were examined as they labored for breath. The doctors justified it as science. In truth, it was cruelty cloaked in the language of progress. Some were injected with bacteria, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, plague. The pathogens ravaged their bodies, and the doctors watched as fevers climbed, skin erupted, blood poured from mouths and eyes. When the infection reached its peak, the victims were cut open, their organs inspected as though they were nothing more than specimens in a laboratory. Weapons were tested with the same detachment. Prisoners were tied to stakes in open fields while grenades exploded around them. Flamethrowers roared against rows of bound men. Biological bombs filled with plague-infested fleas were dropped from planes overhead, infecting not only the victims below, but entire villages across the countryside. Every test was carefully recorded. Every death was treated as data. Children were not spared. Infants were starved to death, their tiny bodies measured daily to track the progress of hunger. Pregnant women were deliberately infected to see if the disease would pass to the unborn child. No horror was considered too extreme. No boundary of morality was left standing. And through it all, Shiro Ishii stood at the center, orchestrating the work with pride. He told his subordinates that their sacrifices, the victims' suffering, were for the glory of the emperor, for the future of Japan. It was a lie that gave permission for the unimaginable. Within these walls, science had not advanced humanity. It had betrayed it. And the cost was written in the silent screams of thousands who never left Pingfong alive. The nightmare of Unit 731 was never contained within its walls. What began in the sealed laboratories of Pingfong soon spilled out across the fields, rivers, and villages of China. The victims were no longer only prisoners behind barbed wire. Entire communities became unwilling test subjects. The Japanese army, guided by Ishii's vision, turned microbes into weapons of war. Aircraft engines roared above the Chinese countryside, their bomb bays not filled with explosives, but with death itself. Ceramic bombs packed with plague-infested fleas were dropped over villages. The insects scattered across the land, latching onto rats, livestock, and humans. Within days, fevers spread, buboes swelled, and Black Death crept from house to house. Thousands perished in agony, never knowing that their killers had worn white coats, not uniforms. Cholera and typhoid followed. Wells were poisoned, rivers contaminated. Soldiers released bacteria into food supplies, turning water and grain into tools of annihilation. Starving civilians who thought they had found relief instead found sickness, their bodies wasting away as invisible armies of microbes conquered where bullets had not. Even the battlefield became a laboratory. Captured soldiers were deliberately infected, then returned to their comrades, spreading disease through enemy ranks. Villages already ravaged by war were struck again by epidemics, their survivors left to bury the dead while fighting their own fevers. The numbers defy belief. Tens of thousands of civilians across Zhejiang, Hunan, and beyond fell victim to plagues unleashed not by nature, but by human design. Fields lay empty, homes abandoned, entire towns reduced to silence. To the doctors of Unit 731, these were not tragedies. They were results, recorded in meticulous reports, analyzed for future use. And yet, the cruelty did not end there. In some regions, when outbreaks grew beyond control, Japanese soldiers marched in with flamethrowers, burning entire villages to the ground in an effort to erase the evidence. The people of China paid the price twice, first with their lives, and then with their memory. For the men of Unit 731, war had become the perfect cover. Every plague outbreak, every mysterious death, could be dismissed as the natural consequence of war's chaos. But behind that mask of chaos lay intent. Behind every epidemic was a hand that had set it in motion. In these years, the fields of China became as much a laboratory as the chambers of Pingfang. And while the world fought battles on distant fronts, here, in the heart of Asia, a war was being waged in silence, a war not only against armies, but against the very idea of humanity itself. For too long, the story of Unit 731 has been told in numbers, tens of thousands dead, countless villages destroyed, statistics that blur into abstraction. But behind each number was a face. Behind every log was a life, cut short or scarred beyond repair. To understand the true horror, we must return to those silenced voices. Many were Chinese civilians. Farmers who rose at dawn to till their fields, unaware that plague fleas had been scattered in the night. Mothers who fetched water for their children, never knowing the wells had been poisoned. Families who cooked their daily meals, only to find themselves vomiting blood hours later. These were not soldiers, not combatants. They were ordinary people, swept into an experiment they never agreed to join. Among the prisoners inside Pingfang were captured resistance fighters, accused of defiance against the Japanese occupation. Some were men who had picked up arms, others were simply suspected. They were dragged into the compound, stripped of their clothes, their dignity, their humanity. There, they became subjects of experiments that no living creature should endure. Women, too, were taken. Some were forced into sexual assaults disguised as experiments on venereal diseases. Others were impregnated deliberately, only to be infected with plague, cholera, or syphilis, so the doctors could study whether disease passed to unborn children. Mothers died screaming. Infants were dissected moments after birth, treated as specimens rather than as lives. Even children alone were not spared. Small bodies were starved so scientists could record the process of hunger. Little arms were infected with pathogens so doctors could watch the spread of disease on a young immune system. They cried for their parents, but their voices went unanswered in the sterile halls of Pingfang. And there were prisoners of war. Russians captured in Manchuria. Koreans dragged from their villages. Mongols accused of resisting Japanese rule. Some accounts even suggest that American, British, and Australian soldiers captured in China were handed over to Unit 731, though their governments buried the truth. The victims had no graves. When experiments ended, their bodies were burned in the crematoria, the smoke rising over Harbin's frozen sky. Their ashes drifted into the same air their families breathed, their names erased, their stories silenced. And yet, silence cannot last forever. In whispers, in fragments of testimony, in the haunted eyes of survivors, the memory endures. An old farmer recalling the day his village was struck with plague. A survivor remembering the smell of burning flesh rising from the compound. A mother who never saw her children again. Unit 731's victims had no chance to speak. But history demands that we hear them. Their voices, though stolen, echo still, calling not for vengeance, but for remembrance. By 1945, the Japanese Empire was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins from American firebombing. The Navy was shattered. The Army, once unstoppable, was retreating across Asia. And in Manchuria, the men of Unit 731 knew the end was coming. For years, they had carried out their work in secret, believing victory would shield them from consequences. But with defeat looming, fear replaced arrogance. Fear not of guilt, but of exposure. They understood that if the world discovered what had been done in Pingfang, the name of Japan would be forever stained with horror. Orders came swiftly from Shiro Ishii himself: erase everything. Every document. Every record. Every trace of the crimes committed. Laboratories once filled with disease cultures were doused in gasoline and set ablaze. Files documenting experiments, meticulous notes of infection, death, and dissection, were stuffed into furnaces until nothing remained but ash. The prisoners, thousands still locked inside the compound, faced a more merciless fate. They could not be freed. They could not be allowed to tell their stories. Guards marched them into courtyards, tied them in groups, and slaughtered them. Some were poisoned. Others were bayoneted. Many were taken directly to the crematoria, their bodies consumed in fire. The crematorium chimneys roared day and night as Ishii's men tried desperately to erase their sins. Smoke hung thick over the frozen sky, carrying with it the last remains of men, women, and children who had been treated as logs. Villagers nearby saw it. They smelled it. But they stayed silent, for silence was survival. Even the buildings themselves were destroyed. Explosives were planted in key structures, laboratories blown apart so that invading forces would find nothing but rubble. Ishii ordered every remaining animal infected with plague, anthrax, or cholera to be slaughtered. He would leave nothing behind that might bear witness. And then, like ghosts, the doctors vanished. Many disguised themselves as ordinary soldiers. Some fled back to Japan, hiding in plain sight among the millions displaced by the war. Ishii himself slipped into the shadows, avoiding capture as the Soviet Red Army advanced into Manchuria. When the gates of Pingfang were finally opened, the world found only ruins. Empty cells, scorched labs, piles of ash. The death factory had been dismantled, its secrets buried under rubble and snow. The silence returned. But beneath that silence lay the truth, a truth that refused to stay buried forever. Japan had fallen. The war was over. But the crimes of Unit 731 had not ended. They had simply been hidden, waiting for history to uncover them. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent, the world demanded justice. At Nuremberg, the architects of Nazi terror were placed on trial. Doctors who had conducted human experiments were exposed, condemned, and executed. The message was clear: crimes against humanity would not be tolerated, no matter who committed them. But in the East, a different story unfolded. In Manchuria, the ruins of Unit 731 still smoldered. Survivors whispered of horrors too great to imagine. Soviet forces, sweeping through the region, captured fragments of evidence, broken equipment, hidden documents, and testimonies from those who had worked inside the compound. They knew something terrible had happened in Pingfong. And so did the Americans. U.S. intelligence officers moved quickly. They hunted for Shiro Ishii and his team, not to put them on trial, but to offer them a deal. The Americans, already thinking ahead to the Cold War, saw Unit 731's data as priceless. Every note on plague, every chart on anthrax, every record of frostbite and cholera represented years of research they could never legally conduct. To them, the suffering of thousands of victims was less important than the potential advantage in the next war. The deal was struck in secret. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, Ishii and his men handed over their research to the United States. The doctors who had dissected children alive, who had unleashed plague upon villages, who had burned thousands of victims into ash, these men were not tried, not imprisoned, not condemned. They were shielded. Some returned to Japan and built comfortable careers in medicine, academia, and government. Ishii himself lived out his days in peace, never facing the justice his victims deserved. The hypocrisy was staggering. While Nazi doctors were hanged at Nuremberg for similar crimes, their Japanese counterparts were quietly protected, their atrocities hidden beneath the classified seals of American archives. The victims of Unit 731 were denied even the dignity of recognition. Their suffering was not just erased by fire in 1945, it was erased again by politics in the years that followed. This was not justice. This was betrayal. A betrayal of the dead, whose ashes still lingered in Manchuria's soil. A betrayal of the survivors, who waited for the world to hear their cries. A betrayal of history itself, silenced in the name of power. For decades, the truth of Unit 731 remained buried, not by accident, but by design. And while the world spoke of Nuremberg as the triumph of justice, another courtroom was denied, another reckoning never came. But not all would accept this silence. For in the years to come, another trial would lift the veil, far from the West, in a Siberian city where the truth could no longer be contained. In December of 1949, in the cold Siberian city of Khabarovsk, the silence surrounding Unit 731 was broken at last. The Soviet Union, having captured senior officers of the Guangdong Army and members of Ishii's staff, convened a tribunal unlike any the world had yet seen. While the Nuremberg trials had dominated headlines in the West, the proceedings in Khabarovsk were barely acknowledged beyond the Iron Curtain. But inside that courtroom, under harsh lights and before Soviet judges, the truth of Unit 731 spilled out in chilling detail. One after another, Japanese officers testified. These were not whispers of rumor or fragments of suspicion. These were first-hand confessions, spoken by the very men who had carried out the atrocities. They described in precise terms how plague fleas had been cultivated, how cholera and anthrax had been spread across villages, how frostbite experiments and vivisections were performed without anesthesia. Their words matched the fragments of evidence found in Manchuria. For the first time, the crimes of Unit 731 had witnesses, and those witnesses were its perpetrators. The Soviets presented documents, testimony, and survivors. Villagers from China recounted the plagues that had swept through their homes after Japanese planes dropped ceramic bombs filled with infected fleas. Families who had lost children spoke of fevers and bleeding, of sickness spreading like wildfire. The stories were unbearable and undeniable. Yet in the West, the Khabarovsk trials were dismissed almost immediately. American and British officials called them propaganda, a tool of the Cold War meant to demonize Japan and its former allies. Newspapers in the United States reported the confessions with skepticism, ignoring the mounting evidence. What was inconvenient for politics was brushed aside, and the truth was buried once more. But history would prove the Soviets right. Decades later, when archives were opened and testimonies re-examined, the details given at Khabarovsk matched precisely with records from Japan and the United States. The so-called propaganda had been fact. The world had simply chosen not to listen. At the close of the trials, 12 men were sentenced to prison. Their punishments were far lighter than the crimes demanded. But unlike in the West, at least here there had been acknowledgement. At least here, in the frozen silence of Siberia, the voices of Unit 731's victims had been heard. Still, the shadow of secrecy remained. The Soviets had spoken. The Americans had silenced. And in between, the dead of Pingfong remained unremembered. It would take decades more before survivors, scholars, and truth-seekers forced the world to confront what governments had chosen to forget. For decades after the war, the name Unit 731 lingered like a ghost, whispered by villagers in Manchuria, muttered by veterans in hushed tones, buried under layers of official denial. The world turned its eyes away, and the silence seemed complete. But silence cannot last forever. In the 1980s and 1990s, the truth began to claw its way back into the light. It began with survivors. Ordinary Chinese farmers and families who had lived in the shadow of Pingfong found their voices. Old men and women, their bodies bent with age, came forward to testify about the plagues that had swept through their villages, the planes that dropped not bombs but death, the children they had buried by the dozens. Their stories were raw, filled with details that only eyewitnesses could know. They demanded recognition, not just for themselves, but for the countless dead who had no grave markers, no memorials, no justice. Historians and journalists joined them. Japanese scholars, some the sons and daughters of wartime soldiers, began digging into archives, searching for fragments of the past that had been deliberately hidden. Brave researchers risked harassment and threats to publish the truth. In China, excavations uncovered bones near the ruins of Pingfong, bones scarred by incisions, evidence of experiments once dismissed as rumor. The earth itself had become a witness. In Japan, activists pressed for acknowledgement. They demanded their government confront what had been done in its name. Exhibitions were organized, survivors were invited to speak in schools, and a slow, painful debate began over memory and denial. Lawsuits were filed by Chinese victims, demanding compensation and an official apology. Though the courts rejected most claims, the voices of the victims were no longer silenced. Western scholars, too, began piecing together the puzzle. Documents once hidden in American military archives surfaced, proving beyond doubt that immunity had been granted to Ishii and his men in exchange for their research. The betrayal, long whispered, was now undeniable. The breaking of silence was not smooth. It was met with resistance, denial, even outright revisionism from those who wished the past to remain buried. But once truth begins to rise, it cannot be buried again. Conferences were held. Films were made. Books were written. Survivors who had once been ignored were now listened to. Their voices carried across borders, across generations. The world could no longer pretend that Unit 731 was a myth. The death factory of Pingfong was real. The crimes were real. And the silence had finally been broken. Yet even as the truth emerged, one question lingered. How much had been forgotten, and how much had been deliberately erased? The answer lay not only in history books, but in the conscience of nations still struggling with the weight of their past. The ruins of Pingfong still stand. Crumbling walls, rusted pipes, and shattered windows mark the place where science was twisted into cruelty. To walk through them today is to feel the weight of absence, the absence of names, of graves, of justice. Yet the shadow of Unit 731 stretches far beyond Manchuria. It lingers in medicine, in politics, in the way nations remember, or choose to forget. The first legacy is one of stolen science. The research gathered through unimaginable suffering was not destroyed. It was absorbed, hidden within military archives, whispered into Cold War strategies. The very data extracted from human agony was treated as valuable knowledge. And so the victims of Unit 731 were robbed not only of their lives, but of their deaths. Their suffering became a currency traded between empires. The second legacy is one of ethics. Out of the ashes of World War II came the Nuremberg Code, a set of principles declaring that no human being should ever again be subjected to medical experimentation without consent. These rules reshaped medicine worldwide, setting boundaries to protect the vulnerable. And yet, the men of Unit 731, unlike the Nazi doctors, never stood in judgment beneath the gavel. They evaded the very justice that created those codes. Their crimes helped shape modern ethics, even as their names remained untarnished in the annals of Japanese medicine. Some of Ishii's subordinates went on to teach at universities, lead hospitals, and influence generations of doctors, their pasts unspoken, their sins unacknowledged. The third legacy is one of memory, or denial. In China, the atrocities of Unit 731 are etched deeply into collective remembrance. In Japan, they remain contested, often softened in textbooks, sometimes denied outright. The wounds of silence still fester between nations. To this day, Unit 731 is not only a story of the past, but a fault line in the politics of East Asia. But perhaps the most haunting legacy is the reminder of how fragile humanity can be. How ordinary men, educated and respected, could turn healing hands into instruments of torment. How loyalty to empire, obedience to authority, and the allure of scientific discovery could strip away every barrier of conscience. Unit 731 is not only a Japanese story. It is a human story. A warning of what happens when morality is surrendered to ambition, when life is reduced to numbers, and when silence is allowed to shield the guilty. The victims of Pingfang cannot speak. But their legacy demands that we listen. For every time history buries such crimes, every time justice is denied in the name of power, the door opens again to the possibility of repetition. The shadow of Unit 731 is not confined to the 20th century. It stretches into our present, and into the choices we make for the future. The fields of Manchuria lie silent once more. Snow drifts over the ruins of Pingfang, covering the broken walls and rusted gates in a pale shroud. To the casual eye, it looks peaceful, a place reclaimed by time, the earth erasing the scars of war. But beneath that snow lie ashes. Beneath the silence lie voices. For decades, the world chose not to hear them. Governments buried files. Soldiers carried their secrets to the grave. Doctors walked free, their hands never bound by the chains of justice. And so, the victims of Unit 731 were forced into history's shadows, forgotten not by accident, but by choice. Yet memory resists silence. Survivors spoke. Scholars uncovered fragments of truth. The ground itself revealed its testimony, in bones scarred by scalpels and in earth poisoned by plague. Each revelation tore another hole in the veil of forgetting. To remember Unit 731 is not easy. It is to confront the darkest side of humanity, the part capable of cruelty so calculated, so cold, that it defies comprehension. But forgetting is far more dangerous. For to forget is to allow repetition. To forget is to betray the dead a second time. The legacy of Unit 731 is not only about Japan, or China, or even the war. It is about us, the choices nations make, the silences we permit, the truths we bury because they are inconvenient. It is about the tension between justice and power, morality and ambition. And it is about the price paid when we choose power over principle. As the snow falls softly over Manchuria, one question lingers, heavy and unresolved. What does it mean when the worst crimes are not punished, but rewarded? The silence of Pingfang is not peace. It is a warning. A reminder that memory is fragile, that justice can be bought, and that history, if ignored, will return. The victims of Unit 731 ask nothing of us now but this: to remember, to tell their story, to refuse the comfort of forgetting. Because the most dangerous atrocities are not only those that are committed. They are the ones the world chooses to forget. Before we end this journey, remember, stories like these matter because silence breeds repetition. If this documentary moved you, if it made you reflect on what humanity is capable of, both in cruelty and in silence, then do not let it be forgotten again. Share this video. Speak about it. And if you wish to walk with us through the shadows of history, through the stories the world tried to bury, then join us here. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and tell us what you think should never be forgotten. Because history's darkest chapters are not only about the past. They are warnings for the future. And together, we can make sure those warnings are heard.